Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're looking at a chapter of history that just completely blows my mind every single time I read about it. You know, when we think about the founding of the United States, we tend to picture this really smooth, inevitable march toward greatness, right? But the truth? Right after winning independence, the young country was a literal ticking time bomb. Between 1781 and 1787, the United States was entirely on the brink of total collapse.
Okay, let's dive into this, because framing early American history as some inevitable success story completely misses the sheer panic of the era. Treat this not as a boring historical inevitability, but as a high-stakes political thriller. I mean, imagine 13 distinct independent entities practically pulling against each other, nearly ripping their hard-won independence to shreds. To understand how they almost lost it all, we really have to look at what they built first. So, Section 1, the Anti-Monarchy Experiment, a firm league of friendship. When the dust finally settled after the Revolutionary War, the absolute last thing these new Americans wanted was another king. They were terrified of faraway British-style tyranny, and that fear fundamentally shaped their very first attempt at a government. Under the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which was adopted in 1777 and ratified in 1781, they intentionally built a national government that was entirely subordinate to the 13 individual states. The most important concept on here is sovereign states. The national government wasn't in charge, the states were. Interestingly, they didn't even call it a mighty nation. They actually called it a league of friendship. Why? Because they simply didn't trust each other, and they certainly didn't trust a central power ruling over them from afar. Because of this deep, deep mistrust, they prioritized state sovereignty above everything else. Smaller states demanded and actually received equal representation, literally one vote per state, because they were just terrified of being swallowed up by their larger, more populous neighbors. Moving on to Section 2, Built to be Weak, the Fatal Flaws. Look closely at this comparison, because it's one thing to have idealistic anti-monarchy principles, but it's another entirely to try and run a functional country with them. This grand experiment quickly revealed some catastrophic structural weaknesses. Plan A, the Articles of Confederation, featured a unicameral or one-house legislature. Think about what's missing compared to the Constitution we have today. There was no separate executive branch to enforce the laws, no independent Supreme Court to settle disputes. It was just a single legislative body trying to manage a very fragile league of friendship. And this structural weakness led to absolute paralysis. Let's run through these flaws. The national government had no power to tax citizens directly. Because they couldn't tax, they had zero money to pay for an army or a navy. They had no power to regulate interstate commerce, meaning states were slapping trade restrictions on one another left and right, completely choking the domestic economy. And the kicker, if they realized this system was broken and wanted to amend the articles, it required the unanimous approval of all 13 states. Asking 13 fiercely independent states to agree on anything is practically mathematically impossible. Which brings us to Section 3, the breaking point, economic collapse and armed rebellion. This is the harsh reality where political theory meets the real world. We are now entering the crisis portion of our ticking time bomb arc, where things go from legally dysfunctional to actively dangerous. Just take the number 65. That represents a 1779 United States continental currency banknote. Because the national government lacked the power to tax, it tried to pay its debts simply by printing money. And what happens when you just print money without backing it up? Right, it becomes totally worthless. This $65 note was practically just a piece of paper. Let's walk through this step by step, because a worthless currency destroys an economy in a brutal chain reaction. First, there was a massive shortage of hard money, actual gold and silver, but shopkeepers still demanded to be paid in it. Second, cash-strapped state governments raised taxes and also demanded payment in hard money to cover their own war debts. Third, since citizens couldn't get their hands on gold or silver to pay these debts, there were widespread foreclosures. People's farms were simply being taken away from them. And fourth, this unbearable pressure finally boiled over into civil unrest, specifically targeting the courts that were processing these foreclosures. And that directly leads us to Shays' Rebellion. Named after one of its military leaders, Daniel Shays, this was a grassroots popular uprising in Massachusetts. And the bitter irony here is just astounding. It really is. The very men who were rising up, the men facing economic ruin and organizing town by town to shut down the courts, were Revolutionary War veterans. The guys who just fought and bled for American independence were now taking up arms against their own state government. So the crucial point is exactly how the national government responded. Well, they were helpless. The Confederate Congress literally could not raise an army to stop the rebellion. They begged the states for money to fund a military response, and every single state except Virginia said no. The Massachusetts legislature was so desperate they passed a riot act, basically absolving officials if they killed rioters. Ultimately, wealthy elites in Boston had to pool their own money to fund a private army under Major General William Shepard just to put the rebellion down. The federal government was practically a ghost. And remember, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The global rivals of the United States were watching all of this unfold. Britain was still garrisoned along the Canadian border. Spain was actively blocking the Mississippi River. Barbary states in North Africa were attacking American shipping. And the federal government was entirely defenseless to stop any of it. The world powers were sitting back, expecting, and frankly hoping that this young nation would just collapse on its own. This takes us to Section 4, the wake-up call, the road to Philadelphia. This domestic chaos and international humiliation was the final straw. It sparked absolute panic among the American political elite, who suddenly realized that their league of friendship was rapidly devolving into utter anarchy. Now, to be fair, not everyone panicked immediately. Read this quote from Thomas Jefferson in January of 1787. "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government." Sounds quite poetic, doesn't it? But context matters. Jefferson was safely serving as an ambassador over in Paris when he wrote this. It's a highly romanticized, theoretical view of the rebellion from an ocean away. But contrast Jefferson's poetry with the words of George Washington, written just weeks later. Washington wrote that if someone had warned him this would happen, I should have thought him a bedlamite, a fit subject for a madhouse. He warns that if the government shrinks from this, anarchy and confusion must prevail. This perfectly captures the terrifying reality of the crisis on the ground. Washington wasn't romanticizing it. He was horrified. And honestly, that terrifying prospect of anarchy is exactly what saved the country. James Madison, one of the key political minds of the era, brilliantly used the shock of Shays's rebellion to lure George Washington back into public life. Washington had retired to his plantation at Mount Vernon, but Madison knew that if they were going to create a new political order, they desperately needed Washington there. He was the most famous and respected American alive, and his presence would lend unparalleled legitimacy to any attempt at reform. If we trace the timeline here, you can see how it all unfolded. In the fall of 1786, they tried to hold the Annapolis Convention to fix some trade disputes. It was a massive failure. Only 5 states even bothered to show up, which left Madison in absolute despair. But then, over the winter of 1786 to 1787, Shays' rebellion reached its peak. That rebellion served as the brutal catalyst they needed. It scared the states so badly that by the spring of 1787, they were finally forced to the table for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Everyone knew the Articles of Confederation were broken, ineffective, and leading to ruin. Yet many Americans were still completely terrified to replace it. Why? Well, because the tension between a weak government that invites anarchy and a strong government that risks tyranny isn't just a historical footnote. That exact push and pull, the fear of both extremes, is the foundational DNA of American politics. Understanding this first failure is really the only way to truly understand the Constitution they eventually built. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking these big questions.